Let's walk through our new and improved essay. By the way, the student who wrote the original essay also did a rewrite. His rewritten essay has some elements in common with this one, especially in terms of the overall argumentative structure, but I've had a larger hand in editing the language for this version. Here's our first page. You'll have noticed that we've added headings to help flag the introduction, the conclusion, and the two arguments presented in the main body. Headings aren't necessary, but they do help the reader to follow the organization of the essay, and in academic essay writing, they're the norm rather than the exception. It is a style thing, though, and whether you use it depends on the venue and the genre in which you're writing. For example, you usually won't find headings in newspaper opinion columns, even though opinion columns really are a form of argumentative essay writing. On the other hand, bloggers tend to use headings a lot, so it really does depend on the venue. Anyway, getting back to the introduction, you'll notice that we've broken it into two paragraphs. One paragraph for presenting background information and setting up the issue, and another paragraph for stating the thesis and giving a summary outline of how the main argument will proceed. The thesis statement is highlighted in yellow, the outline in blue. Notice also that we got rid of that second paragraph of the original essay, the one that we decided wasn't doing any work for us. So the main body of the essay focuses on the two lines of argumentation developed in the first and third paragraphs of the original essay, what we call the hardship argument and the paternalism argument. Let's look at the hardship argument. The choice of the heading is intended to focus attention on the line of reasoning developed in this section, but it could have been something else. This is a style choice. This section starts off much like the original essay, describing the hardships that some students would suffer if laptops were banned. The second paragraph completes the main argument. Notice those two last lines. Students like me would be put at an unfair disadvantage if laptops were banned. Teachers should not be allowed to adopt policies that put a certain group of students at an unfair disadvantage. It's important that you be as explicit as possible about what your conclusion is and how it's supposed to follow from what you said before. Now, in our earlier evaluation of this line of reasoning, I pointed out that the original author never considered any obvious objections to this argument. Well, that's what we do in the next paragraph, in the first line. It might be objected that I'm exaggerating the hardships imposed by being forced to handwrite notes, or that only a very small minority of students will be subject to them. The rest of this page is an attempt to answer this objection. This isn't an easy thing to do. You're trying to argue that a certain proportion of the student population either is suffering or is going to suffer a significant hardship by not being allowed to take notes on their laptops. This makes it an empirical issue that would be best answered by citing research studies on the question. But what if there are no studies, or no studies that you've been able to discover? Then how do you make the case? Well, my thought was that you could at least try to make the case plausible, give some reasons why at the very least it shouldn't be dismissed. And so we have in the top paragraph a reference to an informal survey of the author's peers. Not conclusive by any means, but it's something. The author admits that this is an empirical question, though, and that studies would need to be done to properly estimate just how many students would be seriously disadvantaged by the removal of laptops. Now, the next paragraph is meant to support this line of reasoning by arguing that, even if the numbers are small now, it's reasonable to think that the problem will only increase over time, as more and more students arrive in college with less and less experience with handwriting. Notice the conclusion. Given these trends, college teachers should expect that more and more students will be entering their classes with poorer and poorer handwriting skills. This conclusion is actually much easier to argue for, since the increasing difficulties that children are having with handwriting is easier to document. And the conclusion is simply that it's reasonable to expect that this problem will grow over time. It's rhetorically effective in the context of this argument, because even if someone wasn't convinced that this is a serious problem for college students right now, they may still be convinced that it's likely to become a problem, and that might be just enough to persuade a skeptic to accept the empirical premises of the main argument. Okay, next page. Notice that at the top you see a summary concluding paragraph. This is often a good idea too. If you've just finished presenting an important argument and you're about to switch gears and talk about something else, then it's helpful to flag this transition with a summary conclusion like this, to remind the reader of what you've established and to clearly demarcate one section of the essay from another. Now, on this page, we introduce the paternalism argument, or rather, we introduce the objection to which the paternalism argument is a reply. This paragraph starts off much as it did in the original essay, But here I tried to flesh out the reasoning and fill in the premises that lead to the conclusion that teachers should have a right to ban laptops. The reply starts down here at the bottom, where we identify the key premise that we want to challenge. Where I disagree is with the implied assumption that teachers have an unconditional right to set academic policies that restrict the freedoms of students whenever they believe that doing so is in the student's best interest. I would argue that teachers only have a right to restrict student behavior when that behavior would be harmful to the teacher or the other students. This is the key to the reply. We're basically invoking a classical notion of liberal freedom. Freedom as freedom to act and do as you wish as long as you're not hurting anybody else. We're trying to cast a ban on laptops, when it's done ostensibly for the sake of the student using the laptop, as an unjustifiable infringement on a student's right to non-interference. That's the argumentative strategy, anyway. Do you remember the image of the teeter-totter in our discussion of this argument, and about the need to give some reasons why the student's rights in this case should outweigh the teacher's rights? Remember, we discussed one way of doing this by drawing analogies between a ban on laptop use and more obviously unjustifiable policies, like forcing all students to come to class rested and well-fed. Well, that's what we're doing in the rest of this reply. Here's the description of the policy, and here's the analysis of why it's unjustified, and here's the analogy. My claim is that the argument for banning laptops, based on the harm caused by their use to the laptop user, and not to the other students in the class or to the teacher, is open to the same objection, that it's overly paternalistic. To say otherwise is to deny me the freedom and respect I deserve as an adult. And finally, rounding off the essay is the conclusion. I didn't put a lot of effort into this. It basically parallels the structure of the outline presented in the introduction. But that's not an uncommon stylistic device in argumentative essays. You sort of want the introduction and the conclusion to be like bookends, propping up and framing the arguments in the main body. If there's a certain symmetry between the introduction and the conclusion, that's not a bad thing. Still, you could write this conclusion differently, maybe add some additional commentary on how you argued for it, but the important thing is that it do its job as a conclusion, which is to restate the main thesis and give a brief summary of how the thesis was argued for. One final note before we end this. I just want to reiterate that the purpose of the sample essay and the analysis we did on it, and this revision, was to illustrate some of the general principles of argumentative essay writing. The specific issue we're discussing here is irrelevant. Whether laptops should or shouldn't be banned from the classroom is irrelevant. That wasn't the point of this exercise. So if you find yourself disagreeing with the conclusion of this essay, or wanting to criticize the argumentative moves that were made in it, that's fine, that's great. I can think of 3 or 4 weaknesses in this argument that a skeptic could exploit in developing a rebuttal to this essay. So feel free to take it apart. What I do think is clear, however, is that this revised version of the essay is a better argumentative essay than the original version. The point of the exercise is to get a better understanding of the general principles of argumentative essay writing that explain why this is so that you can bring these principles to bear on your own writing and help you to improve your essay writing skills.